Take a look at Monaco, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. These are countries where their measure of wealth, their GDP per capita at purchasing power parity is double the wealth of the United States. These are the wealthiest countries in the world. Does it matter? Well, if it didn't matter, politicians like Bernie Sanders wouldn't be out there lying, claiming that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world.
Never forget, not for one moment, that you are living in the wealthiest country in the history of the world.
Seeing the wealth and poverty of the American people in perspective, relative to other real-world examples, is important. It matters. It's going to inform our choices as a society, as a democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And lying to people and reinforcing this kind of baseless egomaniacal delusion that the United States is an extraordinarily wealthy country, how does that help anyone? In the English language, we have this peculiar contrast between something being incorrect and something being wrong.
Never forget, not for one moment, that you are living in the wealthiest country in the history of the world.
Many, many, many politicians make this claim that the United States of America is the wealthiest country in the world. And I understand they are normally making that claim in a sort of morally well-intentioned context. Like they mean to suggest to you that the United States of America does not have an excuse for failing to solve its own problems, that the United States of America should hold itself to a higher standard, should do something better or more charitable or more excellent, because the United States of America is, they say, the wealthiest country in the world. It is incorrect to claim that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, and also it is wrong.
19. All right. How do you feel about the quality of the education you're getting?
In some classes we don't have books. In the classes where we do have books, they're falling apart.
And what about the quality of your teachers?
My teachers are the best. They work as hard as they can, but how can you work that hard in the classroom when you have to balance 2 or 3 jobs and also try to support your own family? So it's hard on them, and it's
They're working 2 or 3 jobs?
Yes. So my teachers tell us, like, I gotta go. I have to go to my second job.
Jesus
I have to go pick up
Christ.
my own kids. So yeah, my teachers deserve better.
They sure do. Then you deserve better. Never forget, not for one moment, that you are living in the wealthiest country in the history of the world.
When you look at this chart, do you see the United States as the wealthiest country in the world, the wealthiest country the world's ever known? No, this is a chart showing you gross domestic product per capita at purchasing power parity, right? And if anyone looked at this chart, they'd say, well, the United States is less wealthy than Switzerland, but slightly more wealthy than the Netherlands. So if you think of the Netherlands as a normal country, that means the United States is also just a normal country. If you think of the Netherlands as an extraordinarily wealthy country, then nevertheless, the United States is ordinary precisely because it matches that same mark of extraordinariness. The United States is a country, when you look at these numbers, that is just slightly wealthier than Germany, right? This is not the only statistic, but this is one statistic that very rapidly gives you a sense of wealth and poverty in a country. And it's not calibrated too finely, but when you look at these numbers, guess what? Ireland is much wealthier than the United States of America. That's not a rounding error. That's not just a few percentage points. It turns out Ireland really is wealthier than the United States of America. And this has certain kinds of ethical implications, okay? You may not know this. Ireland spends less on the military than any other country in Europe. They spend less on the military than almost any country in the world. They have a very small military budget. There are actually a couple countries that are proud to have an even lower military budget than Ireland. Well, who's going to help Ukraine? Why is it the American taxpayer who is right now helping Ukraine? Who is going to help Cyprus, the island of Cyprus? All right, there were British armed forces there. In the past, there were Canadian armed forces as peacekeepers. Who's going to help Cyprus? Half of the island is under occupation from the Turks, okay? These things cost money. It's the British taxpayer paying for troops in Cyprus. It's the American taxpayer paying for troops in Ukraine, right? Who's going to provide military assistance to Ukraine? Not Ireland. Well, if you know that Ireland is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, if you know that Ireland is actually significantly wealthier than the United States of America, some of those questions of moral responsibility with military budgets and humanitarian aid, they start to be asked in a slightly different manner. Now, this is not a groundbreaking, tremendously important issue, but I'm raising it as an example because this puts the wealth of the United States in context. America is not the wealthiest country in the world. When people visit the United States of America from Europe, they aren't impressed. They don't think, wow, what an amazingly wealthy country. And there's a reason for that. If, by the same token, when most Americans visit Ireland, they don't think Ireland is an amazingly wealthy country. Ireland is somewhat wealthier than the United States. But you know what? That still isn't the top of the scale. We can keep going up here. Take a look at Monaco, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. These are countries where their measure of wealth, their GDP per capita at purchasing power parity is double the wealth of the United States. These are the wealthiest countries in the world. Does it matter? Well, if it didn't matter, politicians like Bernie Sanders wouldn't be out there lying, claiming that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world. Seeing the wealth and poverty of the American people in perspective, relative to other real-world examples, is important. It matters. It's going to inform our choices as a society, as a democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And lying to people and reinforcing this kind of baseless egomaniacal delusion that the United States is an extraordinarily wealthy country, how does that help anyone? Now, above and beyond the wealth or poverty of the people, there was the question of how much the government can do. Here's a comparison of the United States to Argentina. It's not debated. Right now, Argentina is in an economic crisis. If you look at the chart there, the line towards the very right-hand side, the most recent part of the line, shoots upward. It shoots upward to 86.2% debt to GDP ratio, and that's a crisis. Whole country is in crisis. The line for the United States of America covers a much longer period of time. It's not the same time scale for these two charts. But nevertheless, you can see, within my lifetime, the last 20 years, the line has gotten worse and worse for the United States also. But for the United States, it's now above 100%. It's 106%. So we're all willing to recognize that Argentina has a problem. Argentina has a crisis at 86%. Argentina, the government of Argentina, has got to spend less money because the amount of tax revenue they can raise from their people only supports a certain finite level of spending. Why can't we have that same humble recognition about the United States of America? Why can't we stop repeating this mythology that America is the richest country in the world when it's not? Even if they were the richest country in the world, even if they were as wealthy as Ireland or Monaco, they would still have a finite amount of funds they can spend on these endless interventions, these wars without end, and indeed social programs without end. It's a real question also when we're now looking at proposals for new forms of healthcare, new forms of social services intervention. Sweden is often cited as a positive example of a country that has very high quality social services, very good prisons, very good hospitals, and this sort of thing.
Sweden ranking 5th in a European survey of healthcare quality. The life expectancy, by the way, in Sweden is 81 years. That's 3 years more than in this country.
In Sweden, people go to a publicly run healthcare center for all medical needs. The clinics are run by the 21 separate counties in Sweden. Doctors work on straight salary for the clinic. Richard Salzman has been studying and working with the Swedish healthcare system for 25 years.
Overall, it's a very effective system. The Swedes consider it to be one of the best in the world.
The statistics are impressive. Life expectancy of 81 years versus 78 in the United States. Sweden's healthcare costs are 9% of GDP, less than the U.S. 16%. Per capita spending, half at $3,323 versus $7,290 in the U.S. And there is one doctor for every 277 people, compared to 1 in 416 for the U.S.
How much debt is Sweden in with its very limited tax base, very small country with a small population, small economy frankly, 38.8%. So is Sweden the wealthiest country in the world? Is Sweden extraordinarily wealthy? The wealth of the people, the wealth of the government, the quality of life people have there. Is Sweden extraordinary? Or should we take the much more humbling view that Sweden is just ordinary, and that the United States of America and Canada are actually doing really poorly compared to Sweden, right? This myth of our extraordinariness in the United States and Canada, it's not just challenged by looking at these numbers. I think it's humbled in a really useful, really dynamic way. Denmark. Is Denmark the wealthiest country in the world? No. Denmark we should just look at as normal. But Denmark is managing to provide extraordinarily high-quality social services, extraordinarily generous welfare state, education for the unemployed, and so on and so forth. They're famous for taking very good care of all their disabled people, all these wonderful things. 34% debt to GDP ratio. United States of America, over 106 and no end in sight. Luxembourg. So Luxembourg, it was mentioned before, genuinely could be considered the wealthiest country in the world. They are, if not the wealthiest, nearly so. So enormous amount of money going around in people's bank accounts in Luxembourg. Somehow their government, only 21% debt to GDP ratio. So not just the wealth of the people, the wealth of the government is extraordinary. The government there could take on extraordinary new projects and run up extraordinary new debts. The government in Luxembourg is in a position to try radical new experiments with ecology, radical new experiments with healthcare, radical new experiments with land reform or helping the poor or something. And the United States of America is not. The United States of America is very fundamentally in a much more fragile position. Not as bad as Argentina, but still you should be open to learning from experience, learning from the disaster that's still ongoing in Argentina. Look, Taiwan. Taiwan has a very active, muscular government. It spends a lot of money on the military. It's in a constant state of war with communist China next door, Cold War or low-level war, whatever you want to say. It has to fight for its independence. It spends a lot of money on healthcare. It spends a lot of money on education, so on and so forth. But only 30%, 30.9%, I should say, debt to GDP ratio. Right? Very powerful economy. In some ways, a tremendously affluent society. There is almost zero poverty in Taiwan, even though, they don't show up at the top of the chart anywhere near Luxembourg. They're not anywhere near Ireland, even. All right? In some ways, Taiwan is really a more affluent society than the United States of America, and they're in a much better position for the government to take on new projects on a massive scale, whether that's building new railroads, new ecological initiatives, new healthcare system, you name it, right? And finally, let's just take a brief glance at the nemesis of the United States of America in foreign policy, Russia. Russia is a tiny economy compared to the United States of America. Their economy is about the same size as Italy, right? They're tiny, they're not economically powerful, they're not mighty. But somehow they're managing to sustain their army, their military, engagement in Syria and so on, without bankrupting themselves. While the United States is 106% debt to GDP ratio, Russia is only 13.5%. I'm old. And let me tell you something. I don't go in for any of this stuff of saying I'm young at heart. I'm over 40 years old, and I'm old at heart. But there's one important respect in which I manage to avoid the narrow-mindedness of middle age. And that is that I'm constantly aware of and constantly challenging myself on these types of thought-terminating cliches. Becomes a cliche that America is the richest country in the world, that Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. People say it over and over again, sometimes using it sincerely to call on American politicians to answer to a higher standard, sometimes using it cynically to justify one political decision over another, one policy direction over another. Sometimes it's used to justify ignoring millions and millions of dollars being spent on military adventures overseas. The first lesson that all of us should learn from this example is to live with this discipline in our own lives of questioning, investigating, challenging, and overturning the things that we presume to be true. For just a couple of months, I got into the habit of saying that Sweden has one of the greatest educational systems in the world. And I remember the exact history of how I got that idea. I'm cursed with an accurate memory. And I stopped just a few weeks ago and thought, you know what? I never really did any reading or investigation. I looked into it, and I found out the education system in Sweden has some really serious problems. It really does. They've made some really bad choices. They actually have really serious political questions to ask themselves and a really serious challenge of reform now in trying to save the Swedish education system. It has some advantages. It has some, okay, that was eye-opening. That was educational, all right? I'm not going to go on into my middle age, into my 50s and into my 60s, repeating that in an unchallenged way when the truth is, somehow that crept in as an assumption that Sweden is a really positive example. And you look into it and you say, well, you know what? There's a lot we can learn from the history of what happened with the Swedish education system, but it ain't all good. It ain't all good news, what you're going to hear from Sweden. My warning here is not specific to the left wing. It's not specific to the right wing. It's not specific to the moderate center. No matter who you are, no matter what your concerns are, no matter what your aspirations are for a better society, don't let people bully you with these stated assumptions about what everybody knows. Don't let them bully you. And don't let yourself sink into this habit of mind of invoking conventional wisdom that cannot be challenged. When people try to tell you, everybody knows that policies about getting tough on drugs don't work. When people tell you, everybody knows that in Portugal and Switzerland, they made heroin and cocaine legal and it completely solved the drug problem, right? These are things with no humor. People have said to me, everybody knows. And it's like a 5-minute Google search, just a little bit of reading, and you start to figure out, hey, you know what? We can learn some things from drug policy in Switzerland. We can learn some things from drug policy in Portugal. It ain't all positive. It ain't, okay? Gee, you know what? They made some bad choices in Portugal and Switzerland. Yeah. You know what? Drug policy in Los Angeles, in the United States, may be a disaster. What about drug policy in Singapore? What about drug policy in communist China? What if there are some other lessons to be learned here? Don't let people bully you with what seem to be self-evident truths, like this idea that the United States of America is the wealthiest country in the world, like this idea that the United States of America has unlimited tax dollars. It just takes a little bit of Google searching, a little bit of challenging yourself, of educating yourself. And when you live by that standard, when you really do hold yourself to that higher standard, I think it's fair for you to go around with an open heart and an open mind and challenge others to live up to it also. To say to others, hey, look, I'm engaged in questioning how I know things. I'm engaged in examining my own assumptions and where they come from. I'm still out here learning new things at age 41 or whatever age you happen to be. So why not you too? Why can't you step it up and move past invoking these thought-terminating cliches, these cliches that serve to put an end to rational discourse and hem you in and define the world for you? Why not say, hey, wait a minute, how do we know the things that we think we know? Maybe if we just examine them a little bit, maybe we're going to find that what gets said behind a podium by politicians, those aren't things we really know at all.